So there's one more thing here I want to talk about when considering data types, and that is the very specific data types. So going back into my soils Riley, Kansas Riley, I'm going to open attribute table. Notice that, I'm going to actually dock this down here at the bottom, that there's different types of data here. We have text, we have numbers with decimal values after the n, and we have numbers without them. Well, all of this is actually a very specific type of data, and it can be very important when you're running analysis, because sometimes certain types of analysis will want you to have the same data type. Like, for example, if you're trying to add something together, they want you to add an integer with an integer, or an integer with a double or a float, so on and so forth. It can be quite confusing if you don't exactly know what that means, or if you're not exactly able to identify rather quickly just from examining it this way what type of data that is. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about are the different data types that you can expect to find in applications. So this may not be GIS specific. So the first terminology that you might hear is something called the integer. And sometimes in programming, especially if you're working with a programmer, they may call it int, because that's what it's called in programming. When you write code, it's called an int. So basically what an integer means is that it's a whole number, and you have to be kind of careful when you think about it as a whole number, because basically it's not rounded. So any data that is after the decimal is simply lost. So for example, if we think about the number 2.5, we would normally round this off to a 3. But if we turn 2.5 into an integer, it will simply become a 2, and anything after the decimal is simply just data that just gets lost or removed. Same thing with 2.3. It will simply just become a 2. Now if we were to add these two numbers together, 0.3 plus 0.6, and we want the result to be an integer, we're going to lose the fact that the answer is 0.9, which is much more closer to the value of 1 than it is of the value of 0. But the way that integer works is it's just going to basically chop off anything that's at the end of that decimal. So it's going to say that the answer is a 0. There are two flavors of integers. There is the long and the short flavor. Short integers occupy about 16 bits of data, and the long integers can store about 32 bits of data. And generally by default these days, when you see the word integer and you're wondering, well, exactly which flavor is it, it's going to be the long integer, the 32-bit one. The second type of data type that you can come across may be something called float. And this will allow numbers to occur behind the decimal. And just like the integer can occupy up to 32 bits of data, it can have up to 6 to 8 characters before and after the decimal point. The next type you might hear is something called a long. And a long will hold 64 bits of data, so kind of somewhat similar to the float, but you can hold a lot more data in there. And it has a lot more arithmetic operations associated with it compared to, say, the double. So you may hear something called a double. And a double, just like the long, will allow you to hold a lot more data. You can have up to 12 to 18 characters before and after the decimal. The next thing that you might hear is something called a character or a char. Sometimes they call it char or car. And it's basically a short abbreviation for the word character. And it is a 16-bit Unicode character. And of course, how character is handled, or how much data that you can store in the character data type, is dependent upon the application that you're using. So they say that the max is around 65,535, and again, I'm going to say that this really depends on the application that you're working with, as every application handles things a little bit differently. And then you may hear something called a string, and usually this is used in Java a lot, Java programming. So if you get interested in ArcGIS online, you may use a lot of Java scripting, so you may hear the word string. It's basically a class that is derived from a primitive, so it's somewhat similar to what a character is or a car is. It allows you to basically store text. So integer, float, long, and double only hold numbers, where char and string can hold both numbers and characters. So it's basically a way to store a sentence or something like that. You probably wouldn't want to do a mathematical operation with a char or a string, since it has the ability to hold alphanumeric characters. So all of these data types basically tells your computer how to handle the data that is stored in that specific memory address. So obviously if it's an integer, float, long, or double, you can add, subtract, divide, and do all kinds of mathematical operations with that. And by having something as a character or a string, obviously you wouldn't want to do any kind of mathematical operations on that, because they're probably going to contain sentences or words or things of that sort. And then our last one here is called a Boolean. And a Boolean basically contains, if it is true or false, sorry about the misspelling of false, if it's on or off, or if it's a 1 or 0. So it only holds two types of data, and it's kind of like an on and off type switch to basically, it creates a condition. It's a simple flag for determining if a condition is true or false, to basically eliminate things. So all of these, except for string, are what we call primitive data types. And a string is not a primitive data type because it is derived from a primitive. So if you ever hear any of these terms kind of thrown around in GIS, this is basically what it means. If you run into an error when you're trying to do, like, say, a division operation with an integer and it wants to produce, say, a double, and you get an error that says it can't store the data in the integer because, it probably has a long number after the decimal, that's usually what it means. Is because integers don't support anything after the decimal point. So this kind of gives you a little bit general idea of what's going on, especially if you run into some errors and it's talking about things like that.